Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Following up on our previous program in which we discussed several aspects of the coronavirus crisis and other challenges pertaining to Israel, we will now further analyze the highly complex situation. To do so, we're joined here in the studio by last week's panel, who are Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, as well as Professor Zeev Khanin, who is an expert in Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
Pleasure.
And I'd like also to welcome our colleague, Dr. Fadi Essmaeel, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC Herzliyah. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a short recap on what we spoke about last week pertaining to the COVID-19 impact over the state of Israel.
Israel was late in dealing with the crisis, even though other countries were perhaps more complacent, even more negligent. But Israel is trying to recoup whatever it didn't do in the month of January and February, as it has started to deal with the shortage of ventilators, of intensive care unit beds, personnel, especially as doctors and nurses and other personnel were infected themselves, not being properly protected. Let me bring to mind one point. Over the last 5 to 10 years, the standard of living in Israel has risen appreciably. Anyone who has visited Israel could have seen the construction of new housing and offices, buildings, towers, and the like, skyscrapers. And you could have seen late model cars. You could have seen many Israelis flying abroad. The Israeli middle class has felt wealthier. But the upshot was that Israel, as a country, has invested less in insurance. It has taken less out of every shekel and put it in insurance, including health, not monetary health insurance, but in health itself, including preparing for such a contingency, for a rainy day such as the coronavirus. And so when the pandemic erupted, it was faced with shortages in all the items which I mentioned. And when Israel recovers, there will probably be a new way of looking at how the country runs itself.
Dr. Lerman, the Israeli interim government has used the defense ministry, or the prime minister's office used the defense ministry and also the intelligence agency Mossad, which is under the prime minister's office, in order to combat this coronavirus. During today's program, we'll discuss also the security challenges at hand, but I'd like to hear your take. To what degree has the defense establishment been efficient in being able to accommodate the challenges that Israel has been reluctantly swept into, considering the global implications of this?
Well, in fact, at some point, the defense establishment or the defense minister even tried to take over from the Ministry of Health in terms of managing the crisis. But let me point out 4 aspects. First of all, the management of emergency situations. Any emergency, military, natural disaster, or something like this, a pandemic. At the end of the day, the management of emergency resources is vested in the Ministry of Defense by law, coordinated at the national level by the Prime Minister's office. Within the national security staff, there's a specialized capacity to manage emergency situations. So first of all, the defense establishment has procedures for the management of crisis. The military has several capacities. Quite an interesting story that came out was that the cutting-edge technological units, very innovative, including the technological unit of the Directorate of Military Intelligence, which is a mystery to most Israelis. I would say to the great majority of Israelis know nothing about it. Indeed. All of a sudden, it was, so to speak, put forward, outed in a foreign magazine, in Forbes, telling the story of how they are being asked to innovate in solutions to specific problems.
May I interject? It's like Q in the James Bond movies.
Yeah.
Q branch.
And I would say, we always say Israel is a nation of MacGyvers, so we can probably make oxygen systems out of car exhausts or whatever. We'll improvise. Third story, more episodic than central to the story, but still, the Mossad was charged with looking around the world to see who has a pile of available detection or
testing kits.
Kits. And interestingly enough, it's very clear that they obtained this from a friendly Arab country. Mm-hmm. They do not give the name, but you can speculate. But they've bought it, I assume, or were given the privilege of using it by a friendly Arab country that the Mossad sustains a good relationship with, which again is a fascinating way of improvising a solution. But the most significant contribution in all of this actually comes from the Shin Bet, from the Internal Security Service, which is harnessing its remarkable monitoring capacity, using the ability to access our cell phones in order to track people who have already been diagnosed as carriers and basically tell everyone that has been within the dangerous range of these people that they should isolate themselves and have themselves checked. These are the same capacities that have made the Shin Bet able to go to to send the IDF to the homes of would-be suicide attackers, lone wolves, not organized terrorist groups. Somebody is about to carry out a suicide attack, puts something on his website or his Facebook page, so people would know that he died for the cause, and the Shin Bet is able to do this. So now these technologies are being harnessed against the coronavirus.
Well, if it can be used for good, may it be so. Professor Khanin, to what degree do you think that the current situation in Jerusalem is, even though it's projecting that everything is under control, is it truly so?
Well, if you compare the current situation in Jerusalem and in Israel in general to what is going on in other countries, for instance, in Eastern Europe, we see that they're probably on the safe side, or more or less, on the better side than anybody else. My friends and colleagues that observe the situation in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment, as they see that, for instance, countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Baltic states, they are now getting an influx of people who are like labor migrants that were working in the Central and West European countries, and now they're coming back from Italy, from England, from Germany, and nobody is really checking them besides their temperature. And these countries are very much back in comparison to Israel on doing all this, making all the necessary measures that Israeli government started to do weeks ago. So from this point of view, probably the government is doing what it's able to do. So the question, if we will have a look on the public opinion polls, also the public is actually asking three questions. First, as colleagues already questioned that on our previous show and doing that now, whether a government did enough previously in order to face this situation in more effective way, or everything what is possible to do was done and we have the best of possible. The second question is actually whether what they're doing now is not exaggerated, meaning that all these severe measures, they're good enough in order to stimulate our government or our leaders to continue with them after the crisis, which means either there is no challenge for Israeli democracy. And the third question is more general, more philosophical one. We see that the government is governments of authoritarian and totalitarian states as if more effective dealing with the problem than the democratic countries. So what we are going to learn from that? So if to answer briefly on all the three questions, I would say that concerning the first point, we have question to that. Concerning the second question, it's pretty unlikely that maybe our body still doesn't have enough natural, how you say hisun in Hebrew, in Russian, immunity to the coronavirus, but we probably have immunity to the dictatorship. So probably Israeli democracy is going to survive. And the third point, still we should answer this question not in the short run, but in the long run. So this from this point of view, probably the democratic regime is more effective than dictatorial one.
Dr. Essmaeel, I want to ask you somewhat of a challenging question. As a former advisor to the United States Congress on crisis management, among other key topics, you have had the opportunity to really communicate with your American colleagues, with your Chinese counterparts, European counterparts, and so on, pertaining to this specific issue. And I'd like to ask whether the situation in Italy, for instance, where the construct of society, we see the younger generations who live with their elderly parents for a longer period of time and consequently brought about a lot of the spread of the contagion among the older generations that impacted the health ministry's ability in Italy, which is a strong ministry, to actually function with such an overload of patients, as opposed to Germany, for instance, where the society is a lot more. Children leave their homes at the age of 18. They're a lot more segregated. If the governments tell them to separate from the elderly, we see the spread being a lot more limited because of this social construct, as we can see in Italy, which is devastating. Now, taking that analogy into Israel, I'll reveal we actually are relatives. Your father and my father are cousins. I want to ask you, pertaining to our families who are from an Oriental Israeli background, lived here for hundreds and hundreds of years in the land, to what degree the construct where the family lives together, one house next to another, actually is can be accommodating to the measures enacted by the government, which we hear Prime Minister Netanyahu saying time and time again to the public here in Israel, you need to alter the entire way of the society's conduct in order to isolate yourselves from this contagion, and as such, this would ultimately impact the contagion's ability to spread.
This is a fantastic question. Do we have a week? I mean, this is actually one of the things that I try to hammer into my students and my subordinates at one time. Everything we're talking about now falls under a new science and art called emergency management that has evolved in the United States during the 70s, 80s with the development of FEMA and so on, and it's still a very American system, and some other countries are learning from it, including the Israeli systems. And what I mean is, when we teach emergency management, we tell people it isn't the incident, it is what's surrounding it. And you have to think about the whole thing as a body, as an organism. So it's not the incident that we live in now, this epidemic is not really a health system problem, it is a national problem. And all the points that Dr. Colonel Lerman has brought up, and Amir and Professor Khanin here, and everybody talked about this aspect. This is how an emergency manager has to think. It is not a branch of fire. It's not a branch of health. It's not a branch of law enforcement or any of these things, traditional tactical organizations. We are developing emergency management as a strategic discipline, working for the chief executive officer of that jurisdiction. And even in America, it takes time, even in the advanced states such as California and Florida and otherwise, and New York. If you saw Governor Cuomo, he is an emergency manager, actually a principal, that's what we call it, and so is President Trump. And so, I mean, this is how we look at them. So all the questions, including what you said, we're treating a society, we're treating a community we're not treating the incident. The incident, okay, we're firefighters, police officers, the doctors, the paramedics. We have incident command systems in place. We have national incident management system. We teach that in courses. It's a big thing. We can spend weeks talking about it. We actually do. We have those training courses. But you have hit really the core of the issue, and that is what created the discipline of emergency management. The understanding there is a community, there's a suffering organism here. And as a physician, I follow the ideology of holistic medicine, the one that looks at the patient, not at the disease. Like I was taught in the 80s when I was a medical student. This now you know how old I am. We are a generation who wanted to change it. Let's look at the patient that has the disease, not a disease within a patient. Very important point. The same goes for the emergency management aspect. So everything you said is very, very important. When I want to teach emergency management in college, I teach sociology, I teach anthropology, I teach information science, I teach economics, all of this, land management, business, all of these things, the emergency manager has to know. Otherwise, you are just another fire chief, with all due respect. But I don't need you to know how to put wet stuff on red stuff. I need you to, that's how this is speaking American fire service, I need you to be the strategic thinker. Now, here is my point, another point I want to make. And definitely the issues of how the community operates, the family structure, the bigger family. And by the way, working in Southern California or in the East Coast and so on, when you have people from 187 countries, and every one of those areas, Koreatown is not like Orange County, when Orange County, Westminster is not like Huntington Beach, which is not like Pasadena, which is not like Santa Barbara, which is, it's a complete, it's a mess. You want a mess, every one of those communities operates completely differently.
Little Bangladesh.
And yes, you have that. We have all of them. And they speak all these different languages. Believe me, we know about multiculturalism, and we know about, and you really need managers that are really, really sophisticated. That brings me to the other side of it. A lot of those things that we talk about as if they are amazing, we have already known about for decades. For example, the so-called South Korean model. I've seen analysts on television talking about South Korean model, British model. There are no models. It's just different parts of we have to take all of these measures together if we're going to control this. What we call South Korean model, we've already used in California in the early 2000s. And what really annoys me now is that even in California, they're not using it. So people forget, because they turn over people, what we knew in the 2000s, there's a whole new generation that not really forgot, but it's not, you have always to reteach a system. You know that it's always every new, we know it from the military life, we know it from other lives, you always have to reteach and people forget. Though that business of having just think about a drive-through, that's a very American thought. And you don't even leave the car, and they give you, we used to do it on pandemic, on influenza. How do we control influenza so fast? At one point, we were almost in this fear that influenza will be pandemic and will kill millions. So that's how we developed this fast-moving system. Mm-hmm. That model already was in existence. I was there as a health planner. I was there as a patient. I was every year would be receiving those immunizations from my car every year. We already knew how to do it. Same parking lot, the same guys. We used the RFID systems those days, 2001, 2003. And we're just relearning this whole stuff. The stuff is in the books.
Indeed, it seems like when we're talking about theory, it's imperative for crisis management, but experience is vital to end that crisis in the first place. Mr. Oren?
As Fadi threatened, he did take a week.
I'm sorry about
to
this.
elaborate. No, that's fine. It was fascinating.
Let's move to the security aspect of this crisis, as the coronavirus has overshadowed a lot of challenges that we're talking about for years now, including the challenge of the nuclear aspirations of Iran and its regional malign activities, as well as the issues of the exclusive economic zones in the Mediterranean Sea, where an agreement between Turkey and Libya, or the Sarraj government of Libya and Tripoli, has pretty much carved the Mediterranean into two chunks that the Turks want to take hold over, while at the same time disregarding the state of Israel Cyprus or Greek Cyprus at this stage, Greek and European aspirations to develop here a very significant operation, the East Med pipeline in general terms, which Egypt is also a part of. And now, of course, the enemy of Sarraj, Haftar, on the eastern bloc of Libya, is supporting the other camp that is very supportive to Israel.
Now, these are all very real issues, but they seem theoretical as long as people all over the region, and perhaps all over the world, feel an existential dread of what is happening. And therefore, what you have, which is even more scary than atomic bombs, is the atomization of society. When what is called social distancing is done to an extreme level, you can't have an army. You can't mass people in large formations. Even the Israeli military has given a special permission to its training units to train 30 soldiers together in a platoon, because the Ministry of Health has ordered that not more than 10 people congregate. So the military all over the region, the militaries have to accommodate to the new phenomenon. And when it is over, we will see, of course, a re-emergence of these threats and the way they are taken care of, but not for the time being.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, the Iranian centrifuges continue to wear. Mm-hmm. And they have taken step by step a set of measures that brings them further and further down the road towards the day, which may be not that far, when they will have a breakthrough to the bomb. So that crisis is still ticking. The Israeli capacities need to be there not only to deal with it directly if necessary, but also to deal with the fallout, Hezbollah actions, Palestinian Islamic Jihad actions, so on. As for the Eastern Mediterranean, I would say very carefully that the coronavirus has an impact in one sense. It has contributed to the complete collapse of oil prices. So this is having a deep double impact on Iran, which is dying from the virus, but also dying economically, because it's dependent on markets that have vanished.
And while the Americans offered the Iranians
medications in kind, but and then Khamenei says, I don't want to deal with that because he wants money.
Indeed.
We know what he wants to do with the money, but the offer of help in kind is being rejected. This tells you who is the real enemy of the Iranian people.
Indeed.
Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, things like the EEZ and the pipeline are on hold, because when gas prices and energy prices are so low, it may not be relevant for the next couple of years to even think about
Professor Khanin?
such programs.
If we will take a second, what is going on in a country like Russia, who has a substantial interest here in the Eastern Mediterranean, and what is going on Israel's northern front, Lebanon, especially in Syria. Mr. Putin succeeded to do a very effective step. Russians are sending their rescue teams to help fight coronavirus to Venezuela. They're talking about sending them to Iran, and they're talking about helping to China and even to Europeans if they will be interested. So they were able to sell it to his Russian public opinion as they're in the same package as the Russian troops present in Syria, for example. That means that Russians are present here as the part of their historical, ideological, and moral mission. So concerning what is going on in Syria, as far as I can assume from what I'm hearing from Moscow and read in lines and between the lines, in principle, they're pretty happy about weakening of their friends foes, meaning Turkey and Iran. From this point of view, we should not anticipate substantial change in the Russian policy here.
Dr. Essmaeel, I want to ask you specifically about the situation in Iraq during this coronavirus outbreak and the ongoing crisis, there have been multiple instances in which Hashd Shabi, specifically within this Iraqi paramilitary organization, which is backed by the central government in Baghdad, the Kataib Hezbollah several times fired Katyusha rockets. In one instance, even 18 Katyusha rockets specifically directed at U.S. coalition base, where unfortunately 2 U.S. service members and 1 British soldier were killed in this instance. And even though the Americans retaliated alone, unfortunately, for some reason, the Brits decided not to join in that retaliation, but they retaliated against Kataib Hezbollah's arms depots, and which are transferred from the Iranians. It seems like it was very limited, even though Americans were killed in the situation, and it seems like the coronavirus is limiting the responses of Western societies to certain aggressions. Why is that?
I actually disagree with your basic assumption. I don't think it was a limited response. I've seen the numbers. I think it was, given what was the insult, the strike was pretty hefty. I mean, we have to say that. In Iraq, there is a game changer right now, hopefully, a new prime minister by the name of Dr. Zorfi, who is very much against those militias that are basically ruining the lives of Iraq. We have to make a very clear line between Hashd Shabi as a general term and those militias at different types. And they're not all bad. I mean, again, even from...
They're not all Iranian-backed. There are some Turkish-backed. There are some even... Some American-backed.
The details matter. The details do matter, and I know the history of Dr. Zorfi from the days of the invasion to Iraq, and he's what he displayed over the years was a very pragmatic, reasonable approach to things. Also, as the governor of Najaf and other places, I give him the credit on that one. Last sentence. With all the corona stuff, remember one thing I've learned as an infantry soldier: when it rains on you, it rains also on your adversary. So there's also hurting, not only us.
Indeed. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. The time flew by. We will discuss more on those topics in our next programs, but I'd like to thank Dr. Lerman, Mr. Oren, Professor Khanin, and Dr. Essmaeel as well. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.